A lone torch flickers against a vast desert night, casting long shadows from a procession carrying a gilded coffin. This scene has repeated in countless forms across millennia, as every culture that has ever lived has also faced the great mystery of death. From this shared human experience arose a stunning array of 35 ancient rituals, each a unique attempt to honor, fear, and understand what lies beyond. We will journey to the edges of the ancient world to uncover them all. You will discover how some civilizations returned their dead to the sky, while others preserved them for eternity, and why a Viking chieftain needed a ship for his final voyage. What single belief about the afterlife unites such wildly different practices from every corner of the globe? High on the windswept plateaus of Tibet, a body is given back to the sky. In a ritual known as a sky burial, the deceased is carefully dismembered by a rogyapa or body breaker and laid upon a flat rock. Vultures, seen not as ominous scavengers but as dakinis or sky goddesses, descend in a sacred whirlwind of wings to carry the physical form away. This is the ultimate act of compassion in Buddhism, a final generous offering to other living beings and a profound lesson in non-attachment. The body is viewed as an empty vessel, and by returning it directly to nature, the soul is released from its earthly ties without a trace, completing a cycle of generosity that frees both the deceased and the living from clinging to a form that is no longer needed. Far to the west, in ancient Persia, the Zoroastrians built circular structures known as Towers of Silence, based on a similar principle but a different sacred logic. For them, a corpse was considered the most unclean, corrupting thing in existence. To bury it in the earth, burn it with fire, or submerge it in water would defile these pure, sacred elements created by their god, Ahura Mazda. So the dead were carried to these open-top towers and laid out for vultures to cleanse. The scavengers were not seen as goddesses here, but as sacred agents of purification, performing a necessary and holy duty. In both traditions, from the mountains of Tibet to the deserts of Persia, we see a shared, powerful understanding. Death is not an end, but a transformation. The body is not a shrine to be preserved, but a temporary gift to be given back. These rituals ask us a difficult but beautiful question. What if our final act could be one of pure, selfless giving, completing the great cycle by nourishing the very world that nourished us? While the vultures of Tibet and Persia carried the soul skyward, another culture believed the final voyage required a far sturdier vessel. Picture a Norse chieftain, a great warrior, laid upon a bed of rich textiles within the hull of his own longship. His sword rests at his side, its hilt worn from a lifetime of grip. Beside him, they place his shield, his axe, and cauldrons filled with food and drink. For his journey, they have sacrificed his finest horses and hounds, ensuring he would arrive in the next world with the wealth and companions befitting his status. Then the ship is pushed out to sea or buried within a great mound of earth, a floating tomb set adrift toward the realm of the gods. This was not mere legend. In the wet clay of a Norwegian farm, the Oseberg ship lay perfectly preserved for over 1,000 years. When excavated, it revealed not just the skeleton of a powerful woman, likely a queen, but a breathtaking collection of everyday and sacred items. A beautifully carved wooden cart, 4 elaborately decorated sleighs, and even beds and tapestries were all packed carefully into the vessel. Nearby, the Gokstad ship held the remains of a powerful man, surrounded by the skeletons of 12 horses, 6 dogs, and a peacock, a rare and exotic treasure. These were not just graves, they were meticulously stocked provisions for an endless journey. For the Norse, a glorious death in battle promised a place in Valhalla, the great hall of the god Odin. But how did a soul reach this distant realm? The ship was the answer. It was the physical vessel that would carry the chieftain through treacherous, mythical waters to the afterlife. The entire ritual was a reenactment of this final, perilous voyage. This practice was reserved for the most esteemed in society, for only they commanded the resources and respect for such a magnificent departure. Their belief was not one of passive ascent, but of active, heroic travel. So we must wonder, what would you pack for a journey that never ends? But a ship voyage was not the only way to guide a soul through its perilous journey. Far to the south, in the dry heat of Egypt, the dead were prepared for a different kind of eternity. The process was not a swift sea burial, but a meticulous, 70-day-long transformation designed to cheat decay itself. It began with the most visceral step. A priest wearing the mask of the jackal-headed god Anubis would make a precise incision in the left side of the body. Through this cut, the internal organs, the first parts of the body to decompose, were carefully removed. The brain was considered unimportant, almost useless, and was delicately extracted in pieces through the nostrils using long, hook-like tools. The heart, however, was left untouched. For the Egyptians, the heart was not just an organ. It was the very seat of a person's intelligence, memory, and soul. It would be essential for the final judgment in the afterlife. The body, now empty, was not discarded. It was washed with palm wine and rinsed with water from the Nile. Then it was packed inside and out with a special salt called natron. This was not ordinary table salt, but a naturally occurring mixture of salts found in dry lake beds that acted as a powerful drying agent. The body would lie buried in these natron salts for 40 days, every drop of moisture slowly being pulled from its tissues. The result was a light, desiccated but perfectly preserved form. Meanwhile, the removed organs were also dried, anointed with oils, and wrapped in linen. They were then placed under the protection of 4 specific deities, stored within 4 beautiful containers known as canopic jars. Mseti, with a human head, guarded the liver. Hapi, the baboon-headed god, protected the lungs. Duamutef, with the head of a jackal, watched over the stomach. And Kebesenuf, the falcon-headed god, kept the intestines safe. After the long weeks of drying, the hardened body was cleaned again, its skin rubbed with sacred oils and resins to restore some suppleness and provide a pleasant scent. Then came the wrapping, an act of profound ritual significance. Dozens of priests would work for days, carefully winding hundreds of yards of linen bandages around each limb and the entire torso. Amulets and magical jewels were tucked between the layers, each one a charm of protection for the dangerous road ahead. A scarab beetle amulet was placed over the heart to prevent it from betraying the deceased during the final judgment. The final crucial act was the opening of the mouth ceremony. A priest would touch the mouth, eyes, ears, and nose of the mummy with a special adze tool. This was not just a symbolic gesture. It was a magical reanimation, believed to restore the senses to the deceased so they could see, hear, smell, and speak in the afterlife. They could eat the food offerings left in their tomb and recite the spells from the Book of the Dead. This entire, elaborate 70-day ordeal served one ultimate purpose: to preserve the physical body so perfectly that the soul's spiritual double, its ka, would always have a home to return to. Without a recognizable body, the ka would be lost, and the person would face a second, final death from which there was no return. The Egyptian mummy was not a corpse, it was an anchor for eternity. So while the Norse set sail for the halls of the gods, the Egyptians built a permanent residence for the soul, stocked with everything it would need to live forever. Long before the pyramids of Egypt cast their first shadows, a coastal people were already mastering the art of eternity. In the arid valleys of what is now Chile and Peru, the Chinchorro fishermen began a tradition of mummification that started 7,000 years ago, making their preserved dead the oldest artificial mummies in the world. Their method was not one of preservation through careful drying, but of complete artistic reconstruction. They would delicately disassemble the body, removing the skin and muscles. The bones were then carefully cleaned and dried in the sun before being reassembled, using long sticks to brace the spine and limbs for structural support. The skeleton was packed with clay and stuffed with reeds or grasses, and the original skin was sometimes reattached or replaced with sea lion skin. The final, breathtaking step was to coat the entire body in a paste of black manganese or vibrant red ochre, creating a sleek, statuesque figure with a simple face mask for features. This was not a practice reserved for kings and chieftains. The Chinchorro applied this intricate, weeks-long process to everyone. We have found these mummified forms for men and women, for the elderly, and most poignantly for tiny infants and even fetuses. This reveals a society with a profoundly different, deeply egalitarian view of the afterlife. In Chinchorro culture, death seems to have been a great equalizer, where every single person, regardless of age or status, was worthy of this sacred transformation. They were not simply preserving a body, they were rebuilding a person, creating a permanent, tangible effigy for the soul to inhabit. The sheer effort involved for every member of the community asks us a fundamental question about memory and value. Why would a society with so few material possessions invest such incredible care in every single one of its dead, ensuring that no one, not even the smallest child, was ever forgotten? The Chinchorro honored every life with painstaking care, but another ancient ritual placed the burden of death squarely on the shoulders of the living. In some regions of ancient India, a widow would ascend her husband's funeral pyre and lie beside his body as the flames were lit, a practice known as sati. The word itself means a virtuous woman, and the act was framed as the ultimate expression of a wife's devotion, a final, fiery union that would bring immense spiritual merit to her, her husband, and their families for generations to come. Supporters pointed to ancient scriptures and epic tales that glorified goddesses who performed similar acts, weaving the practice into a complex tapestry of religious duty and cosmic reward. A woman who became sati was not seen as dying, but as achieving a state of such purity that she became a local deity with temples built in her honor. Yet behind this ideal of voluntary sacrifice lay a much darker social reality. For many women, the choice was not free. Family honor, social pressure, and the bleak prospects for a widow in a traditional society all conspired to make the pyre seem like the only path. A widow was often considered an inauspicious burden, stripped of her status and property, facing a life of austerity and poverty. In this context, the so-called voluntary act was often one of profound coercion, a tragic decision made under the weight of an entire culture's expectations. The British Raj officially banned sati in 1829, following decades of campaigning by both Indian and British reformers who saw it not as sacred duty but as barbaric murder. The law, however, could not instantly erase a belief system centuries in the making. Isolated, illegal cases have been reported in remote areas into the modern era, a chilling echo of a tradition that forces us to confront the most difficult question of all. When does a ritual of faith cross the line into an act of oppression? And how can we ever truly distinguish between a choice made from devotion and one made from despair? While sati was a ritual of the living, one emperor prepared for death by building an entire subterranean kingdom. In 1974, farmers digging a well in Shaanxi province, China, struck upon one of the most staggering archaeological finds in history. Beneath their feet lay a vast, silent army crafted from fired clay. This was the Terracotta Army of Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of a unified China. Not just a few statues, but over 8,000 life-sized soldiers, each one unique, standing in battle formation alongside 520 horses and 130 chariots, all built to guard their emperor for eternity. The sheer scale is almost incomprehensible. Each soldier was crafted with an astonishing level of individual detail. You can see different hairstyles, facial expressions, and even the intricate stitching on their stone armor. Some are archers kneeling with hands positioned to hold a long-vanished bow. Others are officers standing tall with an air of command, or cavalrymen ready with their steeds. This was not a production line of identical figures, but a project that employed thousands of artisans for nearly 4 decades, each contributing to a military force of breathtaking individuality. The emperor's obsession was not with death, but with cheating it entirely. Qin Shi Huang spent his life in a frantic search for an elixir of immortality, sending expeditions to faraway lands in a quest for a mythical potion. When it became clear he would not escape death, his focus shifted to dominating the afterlife as he had dominated the living world. This clay army was his solution, a monumental shift away from the ancient practice of burying real soldiers and servants with a ruler. He replaced human sacrifice with the ultimate symbolic representation. Every meticulously carved soldier was a promise of eternal protection, a clay soul to serve him in the spiritual realm just as his living army had served him on earth. The entire complex is a mirror of his imperial court, complete with entertainers, bureaucrats, and even a river of mercury representing the great rivers of China. So we are left to ponder the mind of a man who, fearing oblivion, sought to conquer it with art and ambition on a scale the world had never seen. What does it say about our own desire for legacy when the most powerful man of his age chose to be remembered not by a single monument, but by an entire army frozen in time? The ambition of Qin Shi Huang was to build an empire for the afterlife, but another culture believed the dead should never truly leave the living. Deep in the highlands of Papua New Guinea, the 4 people practiced a ritual that might seem unsettling from the outside, yet was rooted in profound love and respect. When a relative died, the community would gather not to bury the body, but to consume it. This was endocannibalism, the eating of one's own kin. It was not an act of hunger, but an act of mourning and reverence. They believed that by consuming the flesh of the deceased, the spirit of their loved one, along with their wisdom, courage, and virtues, would literally live on inside the family and the tribe. It was the ultimate way to honor a person and ensure they remained a permanent part of the community, a physical and spiritual recycling of life. This deeply held belief, however, had a tragic and unforeseen consequence. In the mid-20th century, a strange and fatal illness began to ravage the 4 people, primarily affecting women and children. They called it Kyuru, which means to shake or tremble, describing the uncontrollable body tremors that were its hallmark. The disease progressed to a loss of coordination, then to severe neurological decline, and it was always fatal. For years, the cause was a terrifying mystery. Medical researchers eventually made a heartbreaking discovery. Kyuru was not a virus or a bacteria. It was caused by infectious proteins called prions, which were present in the brain tissue of the deceased. During the funerary ritual, women and children were typically the ones who prepared and consumed the brain and other nervous tissue. In their most sacred act of love and remembrance, they were inadvertently passing a death sentence from one generation to the next. The connection between the ritual and the disease led to its abandonment. The 4 people, faced with undeniable scientific evidence, made the painful choice to end a tradition that had defined their relationship with death for centuries. This story forces us to look beyond our initial reaction and see a universal struggle. It is a stark reminder that our most sacred rituals are born from our deepest human needs, to honor those we lose and to keep them close, even when the methods carry a terrible, invisible price. The 4 people sought to keep their dead close through a sacred act of remembrance, but in the cold, wet wilderness of northern Europe, the earth itself performed a different kind of preservation, holding bodies in a dark embrace for 2,000 years. In the peat bogs of Denmark, Ireland, and the British Isles, the water is acidic, cold, and devoid of oxygen, a perfect chemical recipe that prevents ordinary decay. Here, the tannins from the sphagnum moss act like a natural pickling agent, turning human skin to leather and bones to a soft, pliable paste. This unique environment has given us the bog bodies, some of the most hauntingly personal faces from the ancient world. The Tollund man was so perfectly preserved when he was pulled from the peat in 1950 that his discoverers were certain they had found a recent murder victim. His face is serene, with a stubble of beard, gentle lines around his eyes, and a simple leather cap still on his head. A noose made of braided animal hide was still tight around his neck. The Grobel man, another famous bog body, lies with his hair still thick and his hands, which showed no signs of labor, resting peacefully. Scientists were even able to analyze his final meal, a gruel made of grains and seeds, eaten perhaps a day before he died. These are not skeletons, they are people, frozen at the very moment of their death. The question that has haunted archaeologists is why? Why were these individuals, often young and healthy, laid so carefully in the bog? The evidence points to ritual. Many, like the Toland man, were hanged or had their throats cut. The old theory was that they were executed criminals or social outcasts, but the care with which some were placed and the contents of their last meals suggest something more. That gruel eaten by the Grobel man was not typical daily fare. It contained a powerful hallucinogenic weed and traces of a fungus that causes convulsions. This was possibly a special, sacred last meal. It seems many of these individuals were chosen as offerings to the gods of the marsh, perhaps to ensure a good harvest or to appease deities in a time of famine or strife. Their violent deaths were not acts of random brutality, but likely part of a solemn, terrifying pact between the Iron Age people and their unpredictable world. The bog was not a dumping ground, but a sacred gateway. To give a life to the dark, watery depths was to give something of immense value back to the earth, a sacrifice meant to maintain the balance of the entire community. These preserved faces, with their quiet expressions, force us to confront a difficult truth about the past. The line between reverence and violence, between a sacred offering and a brutal murder, was often terrifyingly thin. Those bog bodies were laid in the earth as a sacred offering, but another ancient culture used the earth itself to craft a final home. Across the sea in prehistoric Japan, the Jomon people created vessels not for food or water, but for the dead. From about 14,000 to 300 years before the Common Era, they practiced a profound ritual of jar burial. The deceased, often curled in a fetal position, was carefully placed inside a large handmade clay jar, which was then interred in the ground, sometimes with a second vessel inverted over the top as a lid. These were no ordinary pots. They are known for their spectacular, intricate designs, marked by pressing cords into the wet clay to create beautiful, swirling patterns of lines and ropes. This distinctive cord-marked pottery is what gives the Jomon period its name, as Jomon literally means cord-patterned. But why place a body inside a jar? The flexed position of the body, curled tightly as if in sleep, and its placement inside a rounded, sealed container, strongly suggests a symbolism of return. It was likely seen as a symbolic return to the womb of Mother Earth, a completion of the great cycle of life that began in a similar, sheltered space. The jar was a protective cocoon, shielding the vulnerable spirit on its journey and perhaps guarding it from malevolent forces that might roam the world. This was not a journey taken empty-handed. Archaeologists have found these burial jars accompanied by grave goods, small, mysterious clay figurines known as dogu, with their large, hypnotic eyes, were often placed with the dead. Jewelry made from shell, stone, and animal bone also accompanied them. These were not merely personal possessions. They were provisions and protections for the afterlife, clear evidence that the Jomon people believed the deceased would continue to exist in some form, a form that would need tools, charms, and companionship. So, from the protective curve of a clay jar, we see a belief system emerge, one that viewed death not as an end, but as a transition back to the source of all life, a sacred return that required both a physical vessel and a spiritual toolkit. The clay jars of the Jomon offered a peaceful return to the earth, but in the golden city of Ur, death demanded a far grander and more terrifying departure. Within the royal cemetery, archaeologists uncovered tombs that were not just burial chambers, but entire subterranean courts, frozen in a final, macabre ceremony. Sumerian rulers were laid to rest in vaulted chambers, adorned in golden headdresses and surrounded by treasures of lapis lazuli and carnelian. Yet the true shock came not from the gold, but from the people who accompanied them. Dozens of attendants, soldiers, handmaidens, and musicians were found in the tombs, arranged in orderly rows as if they had simply lain down to sleep. This is the Great Death Pit, a mass grave where the royal retinue willingly followed their sovereign into the afterlife. The evidence suggests a chillingly orderly process. These individuals were not victims of violence. They show no signs of struggle. Instead, they drank a poisonous substance, likely a potent sedative or poison, and were then carefully arranged in their places, still holding their instruments or wearing their courtly finery. This practice speaks to a Mesopotamian belief that the afterlife was a direct continuation of earthly life. A king in this world would be a king in the next, but only if he arrived with his entire household, his warriors, and his entertainers. His status and comfort had to be maintained for eternity, but was this truly a willing sacrifice? The line between religious devotion and absolute coercion is hauntingly blurred. In a society with a rigid, godlike monarchy, could a servant truly refuse their ruler's final command? The promise of a blessed afterlife for their service may have been a powerful motivator, yet the social pressure to comply, to avoid dishonor for their family, must have been immense. This ritual forces us to confront the ultimate power dynamic, where the needs of the one completely overshadowed the lives of the many. It presents a vision of eternity that is not a spiritual release, but a permanent extension of the same social hierarchy, a world where you served your master forever. What would compel a person to take that final, fatal cup? Was it faith, fear, or a desperate hope for a place in a kingdom that never ends? Within the orderly world of ancient China, the dead were never truly gone. They were an active, watchful presence in the household, their well-being directly linked to the fate of the living. This belief formed the core of ancestor worship, a practice so deeply woven into the fabric of society that it was less a religion and more a fundamental family duty. It was guided by the philosophies of Confucianism, which emphasized filial piety and respect for elders, and Taoism, which focused on harmony between the living and the unseen world. The family altar was the heart of this practice, a sacred space in the home where the tablets inscribed with ancestors' names were kept. Here, the living performed rituals to care for their departed relatives as if they were still present. They offered bowls of rice, fresh fruit, and cups of tea. They lit fragrant incense, its smoke carrying their prayers and reverence into the spiritual realm. And in a particularly vivid act of devotion, they burned meticulously crafted paper replicas, known as spirit money or joss paper. This was not a symbolic gesture. It was a genuine transaction, a belief that the smoke transformed these paper effigies into real currency and goods for the ancestors to use in their afterlife, providing them with comfort and status. The motivation behind these constant offerings was profound and pragmatic. A well-cared-for ancestor, appeased and respected, would become a benevolent spirit. They could intercede with higher gods on the family's behalf, bringing good harvests, male heirs, and protection from harm. Their continued guidance was considered essential for the family's harmony and prosperity. But this relationship had a dark, fearful flip side. An ancestor who was ignored or forgotten, who received no offerings of food or money, would not simply fade away. They would transform into a restless, malevolent force known as a hungry ghost. These spirits, trapped by their own bitterness and neglect, were believed to cause all manner of misfortune, from illness and financial ruin to family disputes. Therefore, the rituals at the family altar were not merely acts of remembrance. They were a necessary form of spiritual maintenance, a preventative measure against chaos. The family's fate in the world of the living was inextricably tied to the comfort of their dead in the world beyond. This creates a hauntingly intimate vision of the afterlife, where the relationship between generations never ends and where forgetting your past could literally curse your future. In the heart of a Maori community, the sound of a sacred flute announces a time of profound gathering. A traditional funeral rite known as a tangi begins. The body of the deceased, the tupapaku, is brought onto the marae, the communal meeting grounds that are the heart of Maori social and spiritual life. Here, the tupapaku will lie in state for several days, often for 3 or more, never left alone. This is not a time for silent mourning, but for a powerful, collective outpouring of grief and remembrance. Family and community members gather to sing ancient songs, to weep openly, and to share stories that stretch back through generations. The air is thick with emotion, a shared experience that binds the living together as they prepare to say goodbye to one of their own. The final farewell is expressed through a gesture of breathtaking intimacy, the hongi. This is the gentle pressing together of noses and foreheads, a sacred act that represents the mingling of the breath of life. It is the last physical connection, a transfer of spirit and love from the living to the departing. After the tangi concludes, the community believes the spirit of the deceased begins its final journey. It travels to the very northern tip of New Zealand, to a windswept headland called Cape Reinga. Here, according to tradition, an ancient pohutukawa tree clings to the cliffs, its roots stretching down into the sea. The spirit is believed to slide down these roots and leap into the ocean, descending into the underworld or the ancestral homeland of Hawaii. This entire ritual, from the shared tears on the marae to the spirit's leap at the cape, reinforces an unbreakable bond. It is a deep spiritual connection between the people, their ancestors, and the very land itself, where every headland and tree is part of a sacred geography of the soul. Across the windswept steppes of Central Asia, great earthen mounds rise from the grass like permanent islands in a sea of grass. These are the kurgans, the monumental burial tombs of the Scythians, a nomadic people whose name was synonymous with ferocity and skill on horseback. For a culture that lived in the saddle, constantly moving, these massive, stationary structures were a defiant statement of permanence and power, built to mark the final resting place of a warrior elite. Within these barrows, deep underground chambers were stocked with a breathtaking array of gold. Delicate pectorals heavy with animal combat scenes, intricate combs depicting Scythian warriors, and countless golden stags, their antlers flowing back along their bodies, were all placed beside the chieftain. But this was not merely a treasure hoard, it was a practical kit for the afterlife. Alongside the gold, they buried his composite bow, his quiver of arrows, his short sword, or akinates, and his heavy armor. The most crucial companions for his final journey, however, were his horses. Teams of his finest steeds, adorned with elaborate bridles and headdresses, were sacrificed and laid beside him. These animals were his status, his mobility, and his power, essential for the warrior to ride gloriously into the next world just as he had in this one. The most stunning preservation of this culture comes from the high Altai Mountains in the Ship Burials. Here, a natural phenomenon acted as a perfect time capsule. Subterranean water seeped into the burial chambers and froze, creating a permanent layer of permafrost that encased the contents for over 2,000 years. When archaeologists opened these tombs, they found not just artifacts, but the chieftains themselves, their skin preserved and covered in elaborate tattoos. These were not simple markings. One Chiatine, now known as the Ice Maiden, although she was a powerful man, bore incredibly intricate art depicting mythical creatures, griffins and stags, their bodies twisted in a distinctive Scythian style. This was a language written on the skin, a permanent record of myth, status, and belief that would have been visible for all to see in life, and which he carried with him into death. The entire kurgan, from the golden treasure to the tattooed chieftain and his sacrificed horses, was a final, powerful performance. It projected the chieftain's wealth and authority to both the living world and the spiritual one, ensuring his legacy and his readiness for an afterlife that mirrored the one he knew, a boundless steppe where he would forever be a lord of men and master of horses. What does such a fierce, mobile culture tell us by building something so immense and heavy, a mountain they could never again travel beyond. A different kind of mummy was not created by priests after death, but by the sheer force of a monk's own will. In the remote temples of Japan, a small number of Buddhist ascetics undertook a ritual so extreme it remains almost beyond comprehension. They sought to achieve Sokushin Butsu, the state of becoming a living Buddha in one's own body, through a process of self-mummification. This was not a preservation of a corpse, but a deliberate, conscious transformation of the living self into a sacred relic. The journey was a marathon of self-denial spanning 3,000 days, nearly a decade of relentless discipline. It began with a radical change in diet, stripping the body of all fat and moisture. For the first 1,000 days, the monk survived on a meager menu of nuts, seeds, and berries gathered from the forests around his temple. He would engage in rigorous physical labor to accelerate the loss of body fat. The next 1,000 days saw his rations reduced to just roots and the bark of pine trees. His body, already emaciated, would become little more than skin and bone. But the most crucial and dangerous phase was the final one. The monk began drinking a special tea made from the sap of the oroshi tree, the same substance used to make lacquer for bowls and furniture. This tea was violently toxic. It induced vomiting, sweating, and severe urination, purging the body of all remaining fluids and creating an environment so poisonous that even bacteria and maggots would refuse to consume the flesh after death. It effectively pickled the body from the inside out while the monk was still alive. When his body was finally prepared, the monk would enter a small, underground stone chamber barely large enough to sit in. A narrow bamboo air tube was provided. He would assume the lotus position, enter a deep state of meditation, and ring a small bell each day to signal he was still alive. When the bell finally fell silent, his attendants would seal the tomb completely. After another 1,000 days, the tomb would be opened. If the body was found perfectly preserved, untouched by decay, the monk was declared a true Sokushin Butsu, a Buddha. He was lifted out, clothed in robes, and enshrined in the temple as a living statue, an object of eternal veneration. This staggering act of will was rooted in a powerful Buddhist belief. The physical body, with its desires and attachments, is the greatest obstacle to enlightenment. By conquering the body so utterly, by defeating thirst, hunger, and every physical need, the monk was not merely dying. He was demonstrating his mastery over the illusion of the self, achieving a state of such pure awareness that he could transform his own flesh into a testament to enlightenment. What kind of conviction does it take to see the grueling path to death as the only true way to live forever? The Sokushin Butsu monk sought enlightenment through stillness, but in ancient Greece, the dead were honored with thunderous noise and furious motion. When the hero Patroclus fell in battle, his comrade Achilles did not merely mourn. He ordered the construction of a massive funeral pyre, and then, after the flames had cooled, he gathered the entire Greek army for a spectacle of competition. This was not a wake of quiet sorrow, but the original funeral games. The air filled with the sounds of galloping horses and the roar of the crowd as warriors competed in chariot races that were perilous and chaotic, a blur of dust and flying hooves. They tested their raw strength in boxing matches where fighters wrapped their hands in stiff leather straps, and in the discus throw where a heavy stone plate was hurled with a graceful, powerful spin. These were not mere displays of physical prowess. Every event was a sacred offering, a ritual of remembrance performed with the same intensity as the battles they fought. The ultimate prize was not gold or treasure, but something far more precious in the Greek world, kleos, or everlasting glory. By winning, a warrior gained honor for himself, but in doing so, he also reflected that honor onto the memory of the deceased, ensuring their name and deeds would be sung by poets for generations. This was a communal catharsis, a way for an army gripped by grief and stagnation to channel its collective anguish into a life-affirming spectacle. The funeral games for Patroclus, immortalized in Homer's Iliad, were a blueprint for the most famous athletic contest in history. The Olympic Games themselves began as funeral rites for the hero Pelops. According to legend, the games were founded to honor his memory after he won a deadly chariot race for the hand of a princess. The great stadium at Olympia was, in its earliest origins, a sacred cemetery. So the next time you witness the spectacle of an international sporting event, remember its powerful, ancient roots. It began not as entertainment, but as a profound ritual, a way for the living to wrestle beauty and honor from the grip of death, transforming personal loss into a timeless, collective celebration of human strength. The thunder of Greek funeral games celebrated a hero's memory, but in the highlands of Madagascar, ancestors are not just remembered, they are invited to dance. Every 5 to 7 years, families gather at the family tomb for the Famidihana, the turning of the bones. This is not a somber day of mourning, but a vibrant, joyous festival. The stone sealing the tomb is opened, and the ancestors are carefully brought out into the sunlight. Their old, decaying burial shrouds are gently removed, and their bones are lovingly cleaned before being wrapped in beautiful, fresh silk shrouds, often in bright, colorful patterns. The air fills with music as the bundled ancestors are lifted high and danced around the tomb. Family members hold them close, twirling and swaying to lively rhythms, sharing all the latest news from births and marriages to crop yields and local gossip. It is a family reunion that transcends the boundary between life and death. The core belief behind this celebration is that a person's journey to the world of the ancestors is not complete until their body has fully decomposed. Until the very last flesh has fallen from the bone, the spirit remains in a kind of liminal state, still connected to the living world. The Famidihana actively assists this process. By bringing the remains into the air and rewrapping them, the family helps the body along its final physical transformation. More importantly, it reaffirms the unbreakable bond between generations. A happy, respected ancestor kept in the loop of family affairs becomes a powerful and benevolent force, showering their descendants with protection and blessings. To neglect this duty is to risk creating a lonely, bitter spirit that could bring misfortune. So this ritual of dancing with the dead is in truth a profound act of care. It asks us to consider a different relationship with those we have lost. What if our connection to them did not have to fade with time, but could be renewed with music, silk, and celebration, keeping our loved ones as active, cherished members of the family for generations to come? From the joyful dancing with ancestors in Madagascar, we turn to a ritual of blood and terror that has haunted the Viking Age for centuries. The blood eagle stands as one of history's most infamous and brutal execution methods, a punishment reserved for those of the highest status who had earned a special kind of enmity. According to sagas written centuries after the fact, the ritual was a gruesome art form. The victim was placed face down, their back was sliced open with a sharp blade, and the ribs were systematically severed from the spine and splayed outward like the wooden frame of a ship. The final horrific act was to carefully pull the lungs out through the wounds, draping them over the broken ribs. As the victim continued to breathe, the lungs would rise and fall, creating a ghastly, wing-like flutter on their back, an offering to the skies. The purpose was as chilling as the procedure itself. This was the ultimate sacrifice to Odin, the one-eyed god of war, poetry, and death. Odin was a deity who hungered for knowledge and power, and who himself had hung from the world tree, Yggdrasil, for 9 nights as a sacrifice to himself. To give him a high-status enemy in such a spectacular fashion, to transform a man into a living, breathing eagle of blood and bone, was to perform the most potent magic. It was a public display of absolute dominance, a message carved into a living body that announced the practitioner's favor with the gods and his utter ruthlessness. Yet for all its vivid horror, modern historians are locked in a fierce debate. Was the blood eagle ever actually performed? The most detailed accounts appear in Icelandic sagas written down 200 years or more after the Viking Age had ended, in a Christian era that often portrayed its pagan ancestors as barbaric. Skeptics argue that the descriptions could be misinterpretations of skaldic poetry, where kennings or metaphorical phrases compared warriors to carrion birds feeding on the dead. A line about making an eagle soar over a battlefield might have been taken literally by later writers. Furthermore, no contemporary archaeological evidence has ever been found to support the practice. The logistics of keeping a victim alive through such an ordeal seem medically improbable, so we are left with a haunting question. Was the blood eagle a literal, if rare, practice of terrifying religious significance, a story inflated by time and prejudice, or a powerful myth that served as the ultimate warning? Perhaps the truth lies in the fear it inspired, a legend so potent that its shadow has lasted 1,000 years, a story of what humans believe they are capable of in the name of their gods. While the Greeks honored heroes with games and the Norse made sacrifices to Odin, the ancient Romans held a secret fear of the dead who had been forgotten. Each year in May, during the dark of night, a festival known as Lemuria cast a long shadow over the household. This was not a celebration of benevolent ancestors, but a solemn exorcism of the malevolent dead. The Romans believed that spirits known as lemures or larvae were the souls of those who had died without proper burial rites or who had met a violent, untimely end. These were not the honored ancestors who watched over the family, but bitter, restless ghosts who haunted the living out of jealousy and spite. They were thought to bring sickness, nightmares, and ruin to any home they invaded. The sacred duty of driving them out fell to the paterfamilias, the father and head of the family. The ritual was precise and deeply eerie. At the dead of midnight, the paterfamilias would rise in silence. He would wash his hands thoroughly in pure water, a cleansing act before confronting the unclean spirits. Then, walking completely barefoot through the dark, sleeping house, he would make a fist filled with special black beans. One by one, he would throw them over his shoulder without looking back, chanting a powerful incantation. With these beans I redeem me and mine. He would repeat this 9 times, a sacred number of completion and banishment in Roman belief. The beans were not merely a projectile. They were seen as a symbolic offering, a ransom paid to the hungry ghosts. The spirits were believed to follow behind him, picking up the beans and thereby taking the offered payment instead of clinging to the family. After the beans were thrown, the ritual required one more crucial step. The paterfamilias would clash bronze pots together throughout the house, creating a sudden, deafening clamor. The ghosts, now appeased by the beans, would be frightened away by the terrible noise, fleeing the home for another year. This entire ceremony reveals a deep-seated Roman anxiety. Their world was meticulously ordered, governed by laws and contracts with both men and gods. The lemures represented a terrifying breach of that order. They were souls trapped in a state of chaos because the living had failed in their duty to provide a proper funeral. The Lemuria was therefore not just a superstition, but a necessary act of spiritual hygiene. It cleansed the home of a pollution that the family itself may have inadvertently caused. It forces us to ask which is more frightening, a ghost that seeks revenge, or the lingering guilt of the living who may have forgotten their sacred obligations. Deep within the Shanidar cave in Iraq, a discovery forever changed our understanding of human history. In 1960, archaeologists uncovered the skeleton of a Neanderthal man who had been laid to rest tens of thousands of years ago. Designated Shanidar IV, his remains were not alone. Clustered around the body, researchers found dense clumps of pollen from specific flowering plants. This was not a random assortment of weeds. The pollen came from yarrow, a plant known to staunch bleeding, cornflowers with their bright blue petals, and grape hyacinths. These were flowers with medicinal properties and vibrant colors, carefully selected and placed alongside the deceased. For decades, the dominant scientific view portrayed Neanderthals as primitive, brutish cousins, incapable of complex thought or emotion. The flower burial at Shanidar Cave shattered that simplistic image. It strongly suggests a capacity for compassion, for ritual, and perhaps even for a concept of life after death. To gather these specific blooms, to arrange them around a lost member of the community, speaks to a deep emotional life and a desire to honor the dead in a meaningful way. Yet, as with all great mysteries, a debate emerged. Could the pollen have arrived by natural means? Skeptics proposed that burrowing rodents like the Persian jerd could have stored the flowers in the cave long after the burial, their nests contaminating the ancient grave site. Proponents of the ritual burial counter that the pollen clumps were too concentrated and specific to be accidental, and that no rodent burrows were found directly leading to the skeleton. The mystery remains tantalizingly unresolved. This single grave forces us to look back across an immense gulf of time and see not a brute but a person. Someone was mourned, someone was missed. The careful placement of healing flowers asks a profound question about our deepest past. How far back does our need for ceremony, for beauty in the face of loss, truly go? A chieftain's final ride did not always end on the battlefield. Across the Iron Age Celtic world, from Britain to mainland Europe, the most powerful warriors were laid to rest with the very vehicle that defined their power and mobility, the chariot. At a place called Wetwang Slack in Yorkshire, England, archaeologists uncovered a series of these spectacular graves. The chariot was not left intact but was carefully taken apart. The wheels were removed, the wooden frame was dismantled, and all of it was arranged with deliberate care within a deep, rectangular grave pit. This was not a haphazard disposal of a vehicle, but a sacred act of deposition. The chieftain, or in at least one famous Wetwang burial, a woman of immense status, was placed within this wooden framework. They were dressed in their finest, accompanied by a panoply of war. A long iron sword rested in its scabbard, a spear was laid beside them, and a large, oval shield of wood and leather, often bossed with polished bronze, was positioned to protect them in the next life. But this was not just a warrior's kit. The grave was also stocked for a celebration. Elaborate bronze vessels for serving drink and joints of pork were carefully included. This was the provisions for a final, symbolic feast, a last great meal before the journey into the Celtic otherworld. That pork is particularly telling. In a society where livestock was wealth, a joint of pork represented a luxury, a food for special occasions and for the high-born. Its presence signals that this send-off was as much about status and hospitality as it was about warfare. The entire assemblage, from the disassembled chariot to the feasting gear, paints a vivid picture of Celtic beliefs. The otherworld was not a vague, ethereal paradise. It was a concrete place where a person's social standing continued. A chieftain would arrive in style, demonstrating his prestige to the gods and spirits of that realm. He would need his chariot for battle and for ceremony, his weapons to defend his honor, and the means to host great feasts, solidifying his power among the ancestral dead. This was a warrior-centric society projecting its most valued ideals onto the canvas of eternity, ensuring that the leaders who commanded respect in life would do so again in death. What does it mean to pack for an afterlife that so closely mirrors the one you are leaving behind? High above the sacred precinct of Tenochtitlan, a wooden rack towered over the bustling city, its grim silhouette a constant reminder of the fragile nature of existence. This was the Tes Ampantli, and it was studded not with wood or stone, but with the skulls of sacrificed warriors. Far from being a simple monument to terror, this structure was a fundamental pillar of the Aztec cosmos. The Aztecs believed the universe was born from sacrifice. Their myths told of the gods sacrificing themselves to create the sun and set it in motion. But this celestial engine required constant fuel, a debt paid in the most precious substance, the human heart. Without a steady flow of this life force, the sun god Huitzilopochtli would grow weak, the sun would fail to rise and the world would plunge into eternal darkness. Every skull on the T's apparently represented a life given not in vain cruelty, but as a sacred offering to maintain the cosmic order. The victims were often captured warriors from the Flower Wars, ritual battles fought specifically to obtain sacrificial offerings. Their strength and vitality were considered the most potent fuel for the sun. After the sacrifice, the skull was carefully defleshed and a hole was drilled through each side, allowing it to be threaded onto a heavy wooden pole in a neat, horrifying row. These skulls were not hidden away. They were displayed with pride at the very heart of the empire, a public testament to the state's divine duty. The T's apparently was a stark declaration that life, from the grandest emperor to the rising sun itself, was sustained by death. It forces us to consider a world where violence was not senseless, but a sacred, necessary transaction for the survival of all creation. How do we reconcile our own reverence for life with a culture that believed the ultimate act of violence was the only thing keeping the world alive? A single coin could decide your fate for the next century. This was the stark reality for the ancient Greeks, who placed a small silver coin, an obol, in the mouth of the deceased just before burial. This coin was not a sentimental token, but a vital toll for the ferryman Charon. He was the grim, aged figure who piloted his skiff across the river Styx, the dark, marshy boundary separating the world of the living from the kingdom of Hades. Without his services, a soul had no way to reach the afterlife. The price of passage was exactly one obol, a humble coin of little material value but immeasurable spiritual worth. To fail to provide it was to condemn the soul to a truly terrifying fate. They would be forced to wander the misty, desolate shores of the Styx for 100 years, a lonely, restless ghost trapped between worlds. This belief was so deeply ingrained that it transcended social class. From the wealthiest merchant to the most common laborer, families made certain their loved one had the coin. Archaeologists have unearthed skeletons across the Greek world with the telltale silver disc still resting where the jawbone once was, a silent testament to a universal hope and a shared fear. Some wealthier individuals were even buried with two coins, a golden obol perhaps to ensure a more comfortable passage or to tip the notoriously ill-tempered ferryman. The ritual speaks to a very practical, almost contractual view of the afterlife. The journey to the next world was not a matter of divine grace alone, but a transaction that required careful preparation by the living. It presents a hauntingly bureaucratic vision of eternity, where the difference between peaceful rest and a century of desolation was the width of a single silver coin. While coins paid a ferryman in Greece, a different kind of journey awaited the soul in the vibrant world of Haitian Vodou. Far from the macabre stereotypes, a Vodou funeral is a beautiful and essential process designed to guide the spirit home. At the moment of death, it is believed that the gros bon ange, the big good angel or life force of the person, separates from the body. This spirit cannot simply ascend to heaven. It must travel to Jinan, the mythical ancestral homeland that lies beneath the waters. The funeral rites are a carefully orchestrated map for this difficult voyage. The community gathers for a ceremony filled with insistent drumming and ecstatic circular dancing. This is not merely a celebration of life, it is a powerful act of spiritual navigation. The rhythms and movements are a specific language meant to call upon the lower, the powerful spirits that govern all aspects of existence. The family pleads with the lower, particularly with Baron Samedi, the lord of the cemetery, to open the gates and allow the soul safe passage. They also seek to appease the deceased themselves, offering their favorite foods, drinks, and tobacco. A spirit that feels forgotten or disrespected may refuse to leave for Jinan, instead remaining near the living as a troublesome, restless ghost, capable of causing misfortune and illness. The final act of closure comes exactly 1 year later. The family and community reconvene for a ceremony known as the Retire den Bas de l'eau, which means to reclaim from beneath the waters. In a profound ritual, they symbolically retrieve the spirit of their loved one from Jinnah, finalizing its journey and transforming it into a revered ancestor who can now be called upon for guidance and protection. This final rite is as much for the living as for the dead, releasing the family from their deep mourning and allowing them to move forward, secure in the knowledge that their loved one has completed their transformation. It is a system of profound spiritual ecology where the duty of the living is to ensure the dead find their rightful place, completing a sacred cycle that binds all generations together. The Paracas elite carried their status not just in their tombs but in the very shape of their skulls. On the desert peninsula of southern Peru, this culture created a vast necropolis, a city of the dead where they buried their most important figures in enormous conical bundles of textiles. When archaeologists carefully unwrapped these mummy bundles, they found individuals with breathtakingly elongated heads, their craniums stretched back into a smooth, tapered cone that looked almost otherworldly. This was not a genetic quirk, but the result of deliberate and careful artistry performed on infants. From just a few months after birth, a child destined for high status would have their soft, pliable skull bound between two flat boards. The boards were tightly strapped together, applying gentle, constant pressure at the front and back of the head. Over the course of several years, as the child grew, the skull was gradually and permanently remolded into this striking, elongated form. It was a painless process for the infant, but it marked them for life in the most literal way imaginable. So why would a parent do this to their child? The theories are as fascinating as the practice itself. For some, it was likely a powerful marker of beauty and identity, a cultural ideal that set the elite apart from commoners with their normal, round heads. Your very physique announced your noble blood to everyone you met. Another compelling idea is that this was an attempt to emulate the gods. The Paracas people, like many ancient cultures, believed their deities had physical forms different from ordinary humans. Their gods were often depicted with elongated heads. By shaping their children's skulls to match, they were creating a living bridge to the divine, making their rulers appear closer to the gods and therefore more fit to rule. In death, these individuals were wrapped in layers of brilliant, intricately woven textiles, buried with golden ornaments and fine pottery, their distinctive heads the final, unmistakable symbol of their sacred authority. They were prepared for an afterlife where their elevated status, so visibly etched into their bones, would continue for eternity. This ritual forces us to reconsider the very definition of beauty and power. How far would you go to make your child look divine? In the stark landscape of Jain philosophy, death is not an enemy to be feared, but a final exam for the soul. This is the essence of Salikana, also known as Santhara, a ritual of voluntary fasting that marks the ultimate act of non-attachment, undertaken only when death is already imminent from old age or terminal illness. This is not an act of suicide, which is viewed with horror in Jainism. Instead, it is a sacred, publicly declared vow to consciously and peacefully renounce the body. The individual, having determined their earthly life is complete, begins a gradual, meditative process of letting go. They first renounce solid foods, then liquid nourishment, and finally even water, all while maintaining a state of deep meditation and prayer. The entire community supports this journey, viewing it not with sorrow, but with reverence for the person's spiritual resolve. The philosophical goal is as profound as the practice is severe. Jains believe our souls are burdened by karmic particles, sticky residues of desire and aversion accumulated through countless lifetimes. By willingly and joyfully embracing the body's natural end, by feeling the pangs of hunger and thirst without a flicker of desire or distress, the individual burns away these final karmic bonds. This is not a death from starvation, but a liberation from the very need for a body. The ideal outcome is to achieve moksha, a state of pure, infinite consciousness, liberating the soul from the relentless cycle of rebirth forever. This ritual presents one of humanity's most radical answers to the problem of mortality. It asks us to consider if our final breaths could be our most conscious act, a final, graceful bow at the end of a very long performance. In the relentless cold of the Arctic, death was met with a stark and practical grace. For the Inuit, the frozen earth offered no soft graves, and the solid ground was a fleeting concept. Their rituals were born from an intimate understanding of this merciless environment, a necessary partnership with the elements that sustained them. When a person died, one common practice was to lay the body directly upon the tundra, carefully covering it with a protective cairn of stones. This was a sky burial, not for vultures, but for the wind, the snow, and the subtle processes of the Arctic itself. The stones shielded the body from scavengers while allowing the elements to slowly reclaim it, a patient return to the land. In coastal communities, the sea was the final resting place. The deceased, sometimes placed in a kayak or simply laid upon a great ice floe, was set adrift with the currents. It was a solemn committal to the very waters that provided the seals, fish, and whales that were the source of all life. This was not an act of disposal, but one of profound spiritual completion. They believed that by returning the body to the sea or the sky, they were freeing the soul from its physical shell. The spirit could then join the ancestors in a place of abundance, or even more beautifully, be reborn into the animals the community hunted. A great hunter might find his soul again in the strength of a polar bear, a skilled fisher in the grace of a seal. This created a sacred, endless cycle where death directly nourished the continuum of life. The hunter, in death, would become part of the very prey that sustained his people, a perpetual circle of giving and receiving. This belief transformed the harsh landscape from a foe into a partner in a grand cosmic exchange. It makes us wonder if our own farewells could ever feel so deeply woven into the world around us, where the end of one life is a direct promise of life for another. The soil of an English estate held the ghost of a king. In 1939, as the world stood on the brink of war, an archaeologist named Basil Brown unearthed something extraordinary on a mound called Sutton Hoo. He was not digging for treasure, but for history, and what he found was the impression of a ship. The wooden planks had rotted away over 13 centuries, but the very force of their decay had stained the sandy earth, leaving a perfect dark silhouette of a 90-foot-long vessel. It was a ship buried in solid ground, a vessel meant for a journey beyond the grave. Within the outline of this phantom ship, at the place where its heart would have been, lay a burial chamber untouched by grave robbers. It was a time capsule from the Age of Kings, filled with objects of staggering craftsmanship and power. There was a ceremonial helmet of iron and bronze. Its face masked a fierce creature with garnet eyes and gilded eyebrows, a piece that has become an icon of the Dark Ages. A great circular shield, its boss intricately decorated with interlacing animals, lay beside a heavy gold belt buckle, gleaming with complex patterns. They found stacks of silver bowls from the Byzantine Empire, delicate drinking horns, and a purse lid glittering with gold and cloisonné garnets. This was the tomb of a leader, likely Reedwald, a 7th century king of East Anglia, a man who walked the fine line between two worlds. The ritual itself was a powerful blend of old and new beliefs. The ship burial was a profoundly pagan act, echoing the Norse traditions of a sea voyage to the afterlife. The king was equipped with his warrior regalia, prepared to sail to a realm of heroes. Yet among the pagan treasures were 2 small silver spoons, inscribed with the names Saul and Paul, a possible reference to the biblical king and his conversion. This suggests a ruler who was hedging his bets, a man presiding over a society where the old gods of the sea and sword were slowly giving way to the new god from the cross. He was buried with the symbols of his ancestral power, yet he possessed the tokens of a faith that would ultimately condemn such practices. The Sutton Hoo burial is a snapshot of a single, magnificent moment of cultural transformation. It captures a king so powerful that his people sent him to the afterlife in a ship that never touched water. surrounded by treasures that tell a story of a world in flux, a world where one could believe in a Christian heaven while still preparing for a pagan voyage across the stars. The mummy was an anchor for eternity, but the Egyptians knew the soul's journey was only beginning. Buried within the linen wrappings, often placed between the hands or over the heart, was their most essential guidebook for the afterlife, the Book of the Dead. This was not a single, standardized text, but a collection of nearly 200 spells, prayers, and vivid illustrations, each papyrus scroll custom-made for its owner. It was a divine cheat sheet, a collection of magic passwords and protective charms designed to navigate the treacherous landscape of the underworld. One spell might grant the power to transform into a swallow to escape danger, while another provided the secret names of the guardian demons at each gate, allowing the soul to pass unharmed. But all these spells were merely preparation for the ultimate test, the final judgment in the Hall of Two Truths. Here, the deceased would stand before a tribunal of 42 gods, presided over by Osiris, the lord of the underworld. The central, terrifying moment was the weighing of the heart. The deceased's heart, the seat of their soul and memory, was placed on one side of a giant golden scale. On the other side was the feather of Maat, the goddess of truth, justice, and cosmic order. This was not a test of piety, but of moral weight. Had the person lived a life in balance with Maat? A heart light as the feather, free from the burdens of lies, greed, and violence, would pass the test, granting the soul eternal life in the field of reeds. But a heart heavy with sin would immediately tip the scales. The outcome of this failure was utter annihilation. The scales' keeper, the jackal-headed god Anubis, would step aside, and the monstrous Ammit would lunge forward. This creature, known as the devourer of the dead, had the head of a crocodile, the front legs of a lion, and the hindquarters of a hippopotamus. She would consume the heavy heart, and the soul would cease to exist, suffering a second, final death from which there was no return. This entire, elaborate ritual was a powerful engine of morality. It taught that a good life was not just about proper burial, but about the ethical weight you carried in your own chest. It asks a question that echoes across millennia. When your life is weighed in the balance, what will be heavier, your virtues or your sins? Deep in the jungles of the Yucatan, the earth opens up into vast, water-filled sinkholes known as cenotes. For the Maya, these were not just sources of water, but sacred portals to Xibalba, the terrifying and watery underworld. It was here, at the edge of these dark pools, that they performed one of their most vital and desperate rituals. To appease Chok, the long-nosed god of rain and fertility, they offered their most precious possessions. Archaeologists dredging the famous sacred cenote at Chichen Itza have brought up a fortune in ritual wealth, golden figurines, intricately carved jade, and rings of polished obsidian. But the most powerful offering was not an object, it was a human life. The skeletal remains found at the bottom of the cenote reveal a heartbreaking truth. Many of the victims were children, some as young as 6 years old. Their bones show no signs of violence, suggesting they were thrown into the water alive, perhaps while sedated with ritual narcotics. Why children? In the Maya worldview, children were considered pure and untainted, the most powerful messengers possible to send into the realm of the gods. A prolonged drought, a series of failed harvests, these were signs that Chok was angry. The community's very survival was at stake. In a logic born of utter desperation, giving the god what was most innocent and valuable was the only way to plead for the rains to return. This was not random cruelty, but a tragic calculation for survival, a community sacrificing its future in a desperate bid to ensure it had one. The silent, dark water of the cenote holds the echo of an impossible choice, forcing us to ask what any society is capable of when the very sky turns to stone and the hope for life itself begins to fade. A year after a death, a Zulu family prepares not for an ending but for a homecoming. The ritual of Ukubaisa, which means to bring back, is a profound ceremony of return. On this day, the spirit of the departed is formally invited to rejoin the family, not as a ghost but as a revered ancestral spirit, an idlozi. The centerpiece of the ritual is the sacrifice of a beast, often a goat or a cow, chosen for its quality. This act is far more than a simple offering. The animal's life is given to provide the spiritual sustenance needed to welcome the ancestor back into the home. The family gathers as the beast is slaughtered and its bile is carefully examined. A healthy, vibrant gallbladder is a powerful sign, an affirmation from the spirit world that the ancestor accepts the invitation and is pleased with the ceremony. With this positive omen, the family calls out to the spirit by name, formally inviting it to leave the realm of the wandering dead and take its permanent place in the homestead. This is the moment of transformation. The deceased is no longer a soul in transition, but an idlozi, an established ancestor. This new role is one of immense responsibility. The idlozi becomes a guardian of the family, a watchful protector against misfortune and evil. More importantly, it becomes a vital mediator, a spiritual advocate who can intercede with the distant supreme god, Unkulunkulu, on behalf of the living. A family with a properly welcomed idlozi has a direct line to the divine, capable of securing blessings, health, and prosperity. But this sacred relationship depends entirely on the living fulfilling their duty. To neglect the Ukubaisa ritual is a grave and dangerous failure. A spirit that is called but not welcomed, invited but not given a home, cannot complete its journey. It is condemned to wander the edges of the living world, a bitter and restless shadow. This neglected ancestor, forgotten by its own family, transforms from a potential protector into a source of anger and chaos. It may bring sickness, drought, or strife upon the very people it once loved, not out of malice, but out of a profound and lonely despair. The ritual of Ukubaisa forces us to consider the weight of our memory. It asks if our remembrance of the dead is a passive feeling or an active, living bond that requires our care to keep the peace between two worlds. A delicate white thread connects the world of the living to the soul in transition. In Thailand, during the Buddhist ceremony known as Phi Pha, monks chant ancient Pali scriptures as they tie sacred white cotton strings, or sai sin, around the wrists of the deceased and each grieving family member. This is not merely a gesture of sympathy. The thread forms an unbroken circle, a tangible symbol of the spiritual bond that death cannot sever. It is a lifeline of protection and connection, safeguarding the vulnerable soul, known as the KH1, as it navigates the uncertain 49-day intermediate state called the bardo. This period between death and rebirth is seen as a time of profound confusion and potential peril for the disembodied consciousness. The white thread acts as a guide and a shield, preventing the KH1 from becoming lost or attacked by malevolent forces as it journeys toward its next existence. Simultaneously, the rhythmic, resonant chanting of the monks serves a vital, active purpose. It is an act of transferring merit. The family, by supporting the monks and participating in the ceremony, generates positive spiritual energy. The monks then direct this accumulated merit, this karmic credit, toward the deceased. This transferred merit is believed to directly influence the soul's journey, lightening its karmic burden and improving its chances of a favorable rebirth, perhaps in a happier realm or a more fortunate life. The entire ritual is a powerful expression of the community's enduring responsibility. It demonstrates that care for a loved one does not end with their final breath. Long after the body is gone, the living continue to offer support, sending spiritual aid along a simple white thread to guide a soul home. It asks us to consider how our own bonds of love might extend beyond the visible world, acting as a compass for those we have lost. Beneath the bustling streets of modern Paris lies a silent, parallel city built entirely of bone. This is the Empire of the Dead, a labyrinth of tunnels where the remains of more than 6 million people are stacked in macabre, orderly walls. The creation of the Paris catacombs began not with a ritual but with a crisis. By the late 18th century, the city's cemeteries were overflowing, most notoriously the Cemetery of the Innocents. The stench of decay hung permanently over neighboring districts, and the sheer mass of decomposing bodies was literally seeping into the cellars and contaminating the water supply. The city was being slowly poisoned by its own dead. The solution was both pragmatic and monumental. Authorities decided to relocate the contents of the cemeteries into the network of abandoned limestone quarries that snaked beneath the city. For years, every night under the cover of darkness, a solemn procession of black carts would carry endless loads of bones from the world above into the darkness below. But what happened next transformed this public health measure into something far more profound. The quarrymen and priests tasked with this grim work did not simply dump the skeletons. They began to arrange them with a strange and reverent artistry. Skulls and femurs, the sturdiest of bones, were stacked in neat geometric patterns, creating solid walls of the dead. They built pillars of tibias and constructed arches of vertebrae, turning chaotic piles of anonymous remains into a structured, almost architectural space. In one chamber, they arranged skulls into a perfect heart shape. In another, they built a barrel-vaulted ceiling entirely from bones. This was more than just tidying up. It was a powerful physical expression of the medieval and early modern philosophy of memento mori, a Latin phrase meaning remember you must die. In an age of plagues, wars, and short life expectancies, this was not a morbid obsession but a spiritual discipline. The purpose was to cultivate a mindful detachment from worldly pleasures and ambitions. The intricate patterns of femurs and the vacant stares of countless skulls served as a democratic leveler. Here, the bones of paupers and princes were mixed together, their earthly status erased. The silent, grinning faces were a reminder to every visitor, then and now, that this fate awaits everyone. The catacombs are a stark meditation on the transience of flesh and the permanence of our common end. What does it mean to build a monument not to a single life, but to the sheer, anonymous mass of humanity, and to find in that mountain of bone a strange and unsettling kind of order? High above the plains, the dead rested among the branches. For many Native American tribes of the Great Plains and the Southeast, the final journey began not in the earth, but in the air, with the construction of a sacred platform or a carefully chosen tree fork. This was a burial scaffold, a wooden structure built from strong poles, often lashed together with sinew or sturdy vines, and raised high enough to lift the body into the domain of the wind and the sky. The deceased, wrapped in a buffalo robe or a blanket, was laid upon this open bier, their personal possessions often placed beside them. The platform served a deeply practical purpose, elevating the body beyond the reach of wolves and other ground scavengers, allowing for a peaceful and undisturbed transition. But its true meaning was profoundly spiritual. By placing their loved one so close to the heavens, the community was consciously helping the soul on its path. They believed that the spirit was released gradually, not at the moment of death, but as the physical body slowly returned to the elements under the sun and rain. The process of natural decomposition was not seen as decay, but as a sacred unraveling, a patient liberation of the soul from its earthly cage. This deliberate pace allowed the spirit to acclimate to its new state, preventing it from becoming lost or disoriented on its journey to the spirit world. This elevated burial was a powerful act of participation in the natural order, a way of giving the body back to the sky and the wind, just as a sea burial gives a body to the water. It was a ritual of immense patience, reflecting a worldview that saw death as a slow, gentle release rather than a sudden severance. After a year or more, when only the bones remained, the family would return. They would gather the sun-bleached skeleton and perform a secondary burial, often placing the bones in a communal ossuary or a sacred burial mound. This final act completed the cycle, uniting the ancestors and returning the purified bones to the earth from which all life originally came. The entire ritual, from the high scaffold to the gathered bones, was a beautiful, layered expression of respect, honoring both the individual's spirit and the eternal cycles of the natural world that cradle us all. A Roman general's pen recorded one of our only glimpses into the Druid mind. Julius Caesar, during his conquest of Gaul, wrote with a mix of disdain and fascination about these learned priests. He noted a belief that set the Celtic world apart from his own, the conviction that souls do not die but pass after death from one person to another. This was not a simple recycling of life, but a philosophy of reincarnation and transmigration that fundamentally reshaped a warrior's relationship with mortality. Since death was merely a pause, a brief moment before the soul found a new home in another body, the terror of dying lost its power. This belief forged a culture of legendary bravery, where a warrior could charge into battle without fear, knowing it was not an end. Their rituals honored this endless cycle within the heart of nature itself. The Druids shunned constructed temples, believing instead that sacred power resided in untouched groves of ancient oaks. Within these natural cathedrals, rituals were performed under the open sky, the rustling leaves their only roof. Here, the veneration of the human head was paramount. The Celts believed the head was the very seat of the soul, a container of a person's life force and wisdom. After a battle, they would often take the heads of honored enemies, preserving them in cedar oil and displaying them as revered trophies. This was not mere barbarism, but a way to capture and contain the spiritual power of a formidable foe. Caesar and other Roman historians also levied a darker claim that the Druids practiced human sacrifice as part of their most solemn rites. They wrote of vast wicker men, giant effigies filled with living people and set ablaze as an offering to the gods. While Roman accounts must be viewed with suspicion, as they justified their own brutal conquest by painting the Celts as savages, some archaeological evidence suggests ritual killing did occur. A body found in a peat bog, now known as Lindoman, appears to have been the victim of a triple death, struck on the head, garroted, and his throat cut in a single, ritualized event. Whether these acts were common or monstrous propaganda, the core truth remains. Every Druidic death rite, from the philosophical to the potentially violent, was woven into the fabric of the natural world. The soul's journey was mirrored in the falling of autumn leaves and the new growth of spring, a perpetual motion within a living, sacred universe. What would it feel like to face your end with the absolute certainty that it is only a doorway and that the forest itself is your guide? A flickering candle illuminates a darkened Victorian parlor where a group of men and women sit with hands joined, their faces strained with desperate hope. In the center, a medium enters a trance, her voice changing as she claims to speak for a lost child or a fallen soldier. This was the séance, a ritual born not in ancient tombs but in the drawing rooms of the 19th century, a modern attempt to solve the same eternal mystery using the language of science and spectacle. The tools were new, a Ouija board with its planchette spelling out messages, a table that tipped and levitated with coded knocks. The destination for the dead was given a gentle, comforting name, the Summerland, a peaceful afterlife realm where spirits progressed. Yet the driving force behind this spiritualist movement was profoundly old, a raw human grief amplified by the era's brutal mortality rates. Diseases like tuberculosis and cholera carried away the young in staggering numbers, while bloody conflicts like the American Civil War left countless families without a body to bury. At the same time, new scientific theories like Darwinism were challenging traditional religious doctrines, creating a crisis of faith. Spiritualism offered a powerful alternative, a direct and democratic line to the departed that bypassed church authority. It promised not just comfort but proof, the rappings, the floating trumpets, the automatic writing. All of it was presented as tangible, almost laboratory-like evidence that the soul survived. For a grieving mother, the message spelled out on the Ouija board was not a parlor game, it was a lifeline. This fusion of science and superstition made spiritualism wildly popular, captivating everyone from humble housemaids to celebrated authors like Arthur Conan Doyle. It was a ritual that perfectly mirrored its time, using the era's fascination with invention and investigation to answer the oldest question of all. The modern science shows us that the need to connect with those we have lost is a force that constantly reinvents itself, adapting the tools of the present to heal the timeless wounds of the past. From the silent, frozen tombs of the Scythian steppes to the joyful dancing with ancestors in Madagascar, these 35 rituals form a breathtaking mosaic of the human spirit. Each one, from the compassionate sky burials of Tibet to the terrifying legend of the blood eagle, was a rational and deeply meaningful response to the same unanswerable question. Within their own cultural context, these practices were not bizarre or random. They were sophisticated systems of belief, carefully designed to honor the dead, comfort the living, and navigate the greatest mystery we all face. They reveal our ancestors not as primitive or superstitious, but as people grappling with the same hopes and fears that we carry today. They feared oblivion, hoped for a glorious afterlife, and sought to maintain a sacred balance between the world of the living and the world of the dead. Every ritual we have explored is a testament to the incredible diversity of the human imagination when confronted with mortality. They show us that while our methods may differ wildly, the underlying drive to find meaning in loss, to ensure our loved ones are safe on their journey, and to connect with something greater than ourselves is a universal thread that binds all of humanity, past and present. Now we turn the story over to you. Of all these ancient farewells, which one resonated with you the most? Was it the patient sky burial, the epic Viking ship voyage, or the haunting bog bodies preserved by the earth itself? Share in the comments which ritual fascinated or shocked you the most, and subscribe to continue these journeys into the deepest mysteries of our shared past.